Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Mike parked the car in front of the house with a smile on his face. He held a bouquet of white lilies, Rachel's favorite, and felt a simple but profound satisfaction in surprising her. Leaving work early was rare for him, but that week, he had noticed the growing distance between them, each stuck in their routines. Determined to rekindle the connection that brought them together, he planned a special dinner, one he would prepare himself, knowing it was something Rachel would love. As he walked toward the door, the sky was already darkening, and the porch lights cast a warm glow. The moment he stepped inside, silence greeted him, but one thing caught his attention: the music. It was a soft melody, muffled, as if coming from another floor. Mike's heart quickened, not with worry but with curiosity. Rachel often played music when she was relaxing, reading a book, or tidying up the house. He imagined finding her on the couch, wrapped in a blanket with a glass of wine in hand. "Rachel," he called out, but his voice was swallowed by the distant music. He placed the flowers on the living room table and began climbing the stairs, paying attention to every detail. The familiar lavender scent from a diffuser lingered in the hallway, but something felt different. There was an energy in the air, something he couldn't immediately identify. The upstairs lights were on, casting shadows through the door frames, and his steps slowed. He climbed each step carefully, as though he didn't want the sound of his shoes to disrupt the mystery of the moment. Reaching the top of the stairs, he paused, tilting his head to listen more closely. The music came from the bedroom, but now he could hear something else: a voice. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough for him to recognize that it was Rachel. She was talking. He couldn't make out every word, but her tone seemed animated, almost nervous. A sinking feeling began to form in his chest, as if his instincts were warning him about something his mind had yet to grasp. Mike walked down the hallway, his breathing heavier. He passed the photos on the wall, pictures from trips and happy moments that felt both recent and distant. As he neared the bedroom door, he noticed it was slightly ajar. The warm yellow light spilled through the crack, drawing a bright line on the hallway floor. He stopped, hesitating for a moment. Was he being irrational to think something was wrong? Maybe she was just on the phone with her mom or dealing with something trivial. But the feeling wouldn't leave him, as if something unseen was pulling him into that room, insisting he needed to know what was happening. Rachel's laughter hit him like a punch to the chest. It wasn't her usual laugh, the kind he knew from when she watched comedies or recalled something funny. This was different. Nervous. Forced, even. He leaned closer, and now her words were clearer. "You're not afraid he'll catch us?" Rachel said, her voice carrying a tone he couldn't quite place. Mike's heart raced in a way he hadn't felt since his high school football days. Heat rose to his neck while a chill ran down his spine. He steadied himself against the wall, taking deep breaths to calm down. He didn't want to rush in and create a scene, but every fiber of his being screamed for answers. Her words echoed in his mind, every syllable a riddle he needed to solve. Who was she talking to? Why did she sound so uneasy, so different? He knew he was about to face something that would change the course of the night. Mike stood still for a few seconds, trying to process what he'd just heard. His thoughts raced in every direction, each one more chaotic than the last. Anxiety weighed heavily on him, but something kept him rooted in place, as if bracing himself for what was to come. His breathing was labored, and the silence of the hallway made each heartbeat pound loudly in his ears. Inside the room, the conversation continued, and Rachel sounded more at ease than he had expected. She laughed again, but it wasn't the laugh he knew, one of comfort or affection. This was different, almost conspiratorial. He tried to push away the thoughts gnawing at him, but the next words he heard hit him like a blow to the stomach. "No, he never gets home at this hour. It's fine." Every word felt like a dark puzzle piece falling into place, forming a picture he didn't want to see but couldn't avoid. Mike felt anger mix with sadness, creating an overwhelming and confusing sensation. He closed his eyes for a moment, searching for clarity amidst the turmoil in his mind. Am I overreacting? He wondered, trying to rationalize the situation. Maybe this is nothing, maybe, but her words kept replaying in his mind, refusing to grant him relief. He knew this wasn't paranoia. The situation was too strange to be a coincidence. Determined, Mike took a step forward, the creak of the floorboard sounding as loud as thunder. He froze, waiting for a reaction, but Rachel didn't notice. She was distracted, engrossed in the conversation, her words flowing like a current he could barely follow. You're overthinking. He doesn't suspect a thing. That sentence made Mike's blood run cold. Suspect what? He thought. What is she talking about? It was as if the ground beneath his feet had vanished, and he was on the brink of falling into an abyss he never knew existed. The anger surged within him, but something stronger held him back, the need to know the whole truth before confronting her. Time seemed to crawl as he stood there, catching snippets of the conversation, trying to piece it together. Rachel, on the other hand, seemed increasingly comfortable. There was something in her tone that disturbed him deeply, a confidence that he would never find out what was going on. Mike clenched his fists, feeling the tension rise through his arms. He wanted to burst through the door at that very moment, but he knew he needed more. The last thing he wanted was to explode without being absolutely certain of what he was facing. He took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, but the feeling of betrayal consumed him with every passing second. From the other side of the door, Rachel laughed again. Yes, tomorrow is perfect. Same time works for me. That sentence was the final straw. Mike felt as though the air had been knocked out of his lungs. There was no room for doubt or hesitation anymore. Without thinking, he pushed the door open with force. The sound of the door slamming against the wall made Rachel jump, her phone falling to the floor. Her eyes widened in shock as she saw Mike standing there, his expression a mix of disbelief and pain. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the vibrating phone on the floor. The message on the screen shone like a silent accusation, tomorrow, same time? The silence that followed felt endless. Mike stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes fixed on Rachel, who was as still as a statue. The surprise on her face quickly turned to panic, her hands trembling as she tried to reach for the phone still buzzing on the floor. But Mike was faster. He stepped forward, picked up the device, and held it firmly, as though it was his only anchor to the truth he now had to face. Rachel took a step back, her voice shaking as she tried to fill the suffocating space between them. Mike, it's not what you think. I can explain, she said, but the hesitation in her tone betrayed her. Mike didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the phone screen, on the message that screamed the answers he didn't want to know. Tomorrow, same time? Each word felt like a dagger to his chest. He raised his eyes, his expression filled with pain but also with a controlled anger that gave weight to his words. Then tell me, Rachel, what exactly am I thinking? Because right now, none of this makes sense to me. Rachel swallowed hard, her eyes brimming with tears she tried to hold back but couldn't. She knew she was cornered, and any attempt to deny it would be futile. Instead, she covered her face with her hands, sobbing softly. I was just talking to someone, she began, her words coming out in disjointed fragments. It's just my personal trainer. We met a few times, but that's all, Mike. I swear. Her explanation sounded like a desperate attempt to downplay what he already knew. Mike felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted to believe her, wanted so badly for this to be a misunderstanding, but the pieces of the conversation he had overheard left no room for doubt. Talking, he said, his voice firm but emotional. Rachel, I heard you. I heard you say I never suspect anything. That I never come home at this hour. Do you think that sounds like just talking? Rachel tried to move closer to him, but Mike stepped back, raising a hand as if constructing an invisible barrier between them. He didn't want her to touch him, not while the crushing sense of betrayal still weighed heavily on him. Please, Mike. I made a mistake. But it's not what you think. Nothing happened, she pleaded, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty that Mike couldn't ignore. He held the phone up in front of her face, the screen still displaying the message. His eyes locked onto hers, searching for something, maybe regret, maybe a spark of truth, that might convince him not to walk away. Tomorrow, same time, he repeated slowly, almost in a whisper. Does that sound like nothing to you? Rachel broke down. Tears now flowed freely as she sank onto the bed, covering her face with her hands. I don't know why I did it. It was just talking, attention, something I felt I was missing, but I never meant to hurt you. I never wanted it to go any further. Her words cut deep. Mike felt the weight of her revelation settle heavily on his shoulders, crushing him. He wanted to scream, wanted to ask why he hadn't been enough for her, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he took a step back, the phone still in his hand, as he looked at Rachel like she was a stranger. You didn't want to hurt me, he repeated, his voice low, almost a whisper. Rachel, you've destroyed everything. Everything we had. She looked up, her eyes swollen with tears, but before she could say anything, he turned away. Mike felt as though the ground was disappearing beneath him, but he knew he couldn't stay in that room a second longer. He left without looking back, the phone still buzzing in his hand, a constant reminder of what he had just lost. Mike walked down the stairs with firm steps, but his heart felt like it was stumbling with every beat. Everything around him, the objects, the corners of the house he shared with Rachel, now seemed like cruel reminders of what they had and what he felt he was losing at that moment. He still held the phone, not knowing why he couldn't let it go. Maybe because it now symbolized the truth he didn't want to face but had no choice but to accept. Reaching the living room, he stopped by the table where he had left the bouquet of white lilies. They were still there, so fresh, so pure, so disconnected from the reality that now consumed him. He looked at the flowers for a moment, and the irony of the situation hit him hard. The intention behind them now seemed naive, out of place amidst the pain that filled him. He ran a hand over his face, trying to clear his thoughts, but everything around him seemed to spin. Rachel's muffled sobs from upstairs echoed in the house, a constant reminder of what he had just witnessed. The phone vibrated again in his hand, pulling him out of his thoughts. He looked at the screen, and a mix of anger and curiosity overwhelmed him. This time, it was a different message. It didn't have the same casual tone he had read earlier. Are you okay? Did he suspect anything? The message read. Mike's breathing quickened, and heat surged through his body like a wave. The confirmation was there. It wasn't just innocent chatting, it wasn't just a distraction. It was something planned, something kept hidden. He knew he should drop the phone, should just walk away, but he couldn't resist. A mix of a need for understanding and a desire for answers drove him to open the previous messages. As he read, the weight of the betrayal grew heavier. The exchanges were filled with insinuations and subtle planning, things Rachel had never shared with him. Pieces of a secret world she had built away from his sight. Each message felt like it tore away a piece of his trust, leaving him emptier each time. He read until he couldn't anymore. Not because he had reached the end, but because he felt that if he continued, something inside him would break irreparably. He closed his eyes and let out a heavy sigh, trying to decide what to do next. He couldn't go back up there to confront her again. What more was there to say? Her words had already been lost in the void between them. Mike placed the phone on the table next to the flowers, as if leaving behind the symbol of everything he had uncovered. But before he could take the next step, he felt a hand on his shoulder. Rachel was there, her face streaked with tears, her eyes red but filled with an expression that mixed desperation and hope. She opened her mouth to speak, but Mike raised his hand, signaling for silence. "No. Not now." His voice was low but firm, each word carrying a weight he could no longer bear. Rachel shook her head, struggling to hold back more tears. "Mike, please. I know I made a mistake, but, please listen to me. I don't want to lose you." He looked at her, and for a brief moment, he almost gave in. There was so much love mixed with the pain he felt, so much of their history still alive in his heart. But then, the image of the message flashing on the phone returned to his mind, along with the certainty that something had changed forever. He stepped back, breaking the physical contact between them, and Rachel seemed to shrink under the weight of his rejection. "Rachel, I don't know what you expect me to say. You've destroyed something I never thought could be broken." He paused, looking at her, searching for any sign that she understood the depth of the damage. "I just need time. Space to breathe. Because right now, all I see is this. You and this." Without waiting for a response, he grabbed his car keys from the entryway table and walked out the door. The cool night air enveloped him but brought no relief. He got into the car but didn't start the engine right away. He just sat there, hands on the steering wheel, trying to find some sense amid the chaos of his night. The silence in the car was almost comforting, but he knew the quiet outside couldn't drown out the storm raging inside him. Mike sat in the car, the sound of the keys dangling against the dashboard swaying slightly with his breathing. The silence outside was nearly absolute, broken only by the occasional wind rustling through the trees on the street. He stared at the steering wheel, at the distorted reflection of his trembling hands in the leather's sheen. He didn't know how long he'd been sitting there since leaving the house. It could have been minutes or hours, time seemed meaningless at that point. His mind spun, replaying every moment of the night. The message, Rachel's words, the desperation in her face. He tried, somehow, to rearrange it all into something that made sense, but it was like trying to piece together a puzzle with mismatched parts. He thought he knew Rachel, or at least he had known her until tonight. But now, as he revisited the past few months, the memories took on a different tone. Small gestures, trivial excuses, quickly deleted messages on her phone. Things that once seemed insignificant now stood out as signs of something larger he had overlooked. He closed his eyes, gripping the wheel tightly, trying to push away those images. But even in the darkness of his mind, the message on the phone burned like an invisible scar. He wondered how it had come to this. Was there something he could have done? Had he been neglectful, distracted, or simply not enough? These questions circled in his mind, each one more cruel than the last. And deep down, he knew he wouldn't find the answers now. A notification sound from his own phone pulled him out of his thoughts. He picked it up hesitantly, almost afraid of what it might be. It was a message from a close friend, Mark, someone who had always been like a brother to him. "Hey, are you okay? You seemed off at work today." Mike stared at the screen for a moment, feeling a lump tighten in his throat. Mark was the one person he felt could understand, but how could he explain something he himself still couldn't comprehend? He placed the phone back on the seat beside him, deciding now wasn't the time to respond. He knew he couldn't sit there forever. What he truly needed was a space free of the night's memories or Rachel's lingering presence. So, without thinking too much, he started the car and began driving. He didn't have a destination, he just drove, guided by a need for movement, to escape something that seemed to relentlessly chase his mind. The streets were deserted, lit by dim streetlights casting distorted shadows on the pavement. He passed familiar places that once brought comfort, the cafe where he and Rachel used to have breakfast on Saturdays, the park where he'd planned to propose but got too nervous and ended up doing it in the car. Now, each spot felt loaded with painful irony, as if the universe were mocking him. Eventually, he found himself parked in front of a closed gym. The glass facade reflected the streetlights, and through the darkness, he could see the neatly arranged equipment, the stationary treadmills, the orderly weights. The sight was ordinary but carried significance. It was there that Rachel had first mentioned her personal trainer. Mike had never paid attention. He trusted her, he always had. He thought about going in, maybe confronting whoever the man was. But the idea felt absurd and desperate. What would he gain from it? More empty words? More excuses that would only deepen the pain? He shook his head, muttering to himself, "This won't change anything." The exhaustion finally caught up to him. He felt the weight of the night pressing down on his shoulders, consuming whatever energy he had left. He was tired, not just physically but emotionally, mentally. Yet he knew this was only the first of many nights he would have to face the reality of what had happened. Resting his head against the steering wheel, he allowed himself, for the first time, to feel the full depth of the emptiness inside him. Mike stayed with his forehead against the steering wheel. The emotional exhaustion seemed to drain whatever strength he had left. The memories, the thoughts, and the doubts whirled in his mind like an uncontrollable storm, and he realized he needed a starting point, something to help him begin to reorganize his life after that night. Finally, he lifted his head and looked up at the sky through the windshield. The stars were scattered, shining with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the chaos within him. For a moment, he wondered how the world could appear so peaceful while his life seemed to be falling apart. He took a deep breath, trying to draw some of that serenity into himself. Suddenly, something within him began to shift. Maybe it was the exhaustion reaching a critical point, or maybe it was the instinct for emotional survival. But he felt a spark of clarity amidst the turmoil. He realized that no matter how crushing Rachel's betrayal was, he still had control over one thing: how he chose to respond from that moment forward. The pain was there, raw and overwhelming, but he knew he didn't want to be defined by it. He wanted something more for himself, something beyond the suffering. Mike started driving again, this time with more purpose. He decided he needed a place where he could think, where he could feel everything he needed to without interruption. He arrived at a park he used to visit in the early years of his marriage. It was late, and the place was deserted. He parked the car and got out, letting the cool night air fill his lungs. He walked to a bench near a small lake, where the water reflected the starlight. There, sitting under the open sky, he finally allowed the tears to fall freely. As painful as it was, he knew he needed to let it out. He cried for everything, for the betrayal, the loss of trust, the years he had invested in a marriage that now felt so fragile. But as the tears fell, he felt something else. A weight began to lift, as though each tear carried away a fragment of the pain. He knew it wouldn't be a quick or easy process, but there, on that lonely bench, he took the first step toward healing. While sitting there, surrounded by the night's silence, he began to reflect on what he truly wanted for his future. He knew he couldn't go back in time or undo what Rachel had done. But he also knew he didn't have to carry that burden alone. He thought of Mark, of his earlier message, and realized it might be time to open up to someone. Mark was more than a friend, he was someone Mike knew he could trust. He picked up his phone and typed a short message: "You were right. I'm not okay. Can we talk?" He sent it before he could hesitate, and the simple act of pressing send felt like a release. He didn't know what to expect from the conversation, but he knew he had to start rebuilding himself, even if it was one small step at a time. As he waited for a reply, he looked out at the lake and began to remember who he was before Rachel, before the marriage. He thought about the dreams he had, the things he loved to do but had set aside over the years. There was a life there, one he could reclaim, or even reinvent. For the first time that night, he felt something close to hope. It wasn't big or strong, but it was there, a spark ready to grow. The phone vibrated in his hand, and a message from Mark appeared: "Of course. I'm here for you. Do you want to talk now or tomorrow?" Mike smiled faintly, feeling a little less alone. He replied, "Tomorrow, thanks. I need to sort out my thoughts." As he put the phone away, he realized that this decision, small as it was a step toward who he wanted to be, someone who, despite the pain, chose to move forward. That night, Mike returned to the car and drove, not to the house he shared with Rachel but to his parents' home, where he knew he would find comfort. He knew the journey ahead would be long, filled with ups and downs, but for the first time since opening that door and watching his world collapse, he felt he could find himself again. The betrayal would not be the end of his story but the beginning of a new chapter, one where he would choose his own path without looking back. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.